To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
And then just Jim Delbridge with 5 to 7, which is the opening music, of course, to Islands at War, our monthly look at the occupation of the Channel Islands with me, Keith Bengelli, and of course with
Nick Lahire. Morning, Keith.
Morning, Nick. Right, Nick. Now, we, in August 1944, have a new diary to mine. It's very, very important, written by Hans Max Baron von und zu Aufsess, who was a Franconian, which is Bavarian, aristocrat, who was a administrative officer of Field Kommandantur 515, initially in Jersey from January 42, and then arriving in Guernsey around about August, maybe a little bit before August 44. Nick, you got a little bit of background on the Baron?
I quite like his diary. Dare I say, he's a little bit bitchy. He writes some really interesting things about some of his colleagues and other people that he encounters through the occupation. And I just quite like it because it's just like there's no filter.
Well, he's an aristocrat. He is slightly detached from it all. His whole sort of demeanour is, well, this is something that's going on in front of me, and I'm merely watching it happen.
You do get a little bit of a feeling I'm above all of these people in a kind of feudal, and we'll touch on that as we go through this episode. But it's because he is Prussian aristocracy, you definitely get the impression that he feels, well, I'm above these folks and I'm just observing what's going on, apart from when he gets involved in a few things, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But he does little pen portraits of people in words, just a few sentences about people, some of them very unkind, to be fair, but probably justified in the case of most people.
I think it's true to say he didn't have the greatest faith in the regime at the time either.
Oh, well, no, and he was under suspicion when the bomb plot happened as to what was going on. I think his wife got arrested in Germany.
I think she did. And Nick, this isn't the diaries as they have been recently published on Blue Ormer, and these are unredacted diaries. I think they have been published by the Baron himself a little while ago.
They were published. I can't remember when it was. It 80s, mid 80s, something like that. And you only have to look at the size of the book because you've read the previous version. And the size of the book is much smaller. And this is just brilliant.
Well, it's got explanatory footnotes as well. We can give a little bit more detail about the book, I think, probably on social media. Van Elfers lived from 1906 to 1993, so a long life. And just his role, Nick, Chief Administrative Officer of Field Kommandantur 515, what was...
The 515 Field Kommandantur was just basically dealing with the civilian population and like civilian administration of the occupation itself and that side of things.
So it's almost like the military version of the civil service.
A little bit, combined with having the police involved as well, the German Feldpolizei. I can never pronounce that properly. Someone's probably listening and cringing when they hear it.
Well, the reason we've done a little bit of a preamble on the Baron is from now on until our series concludes, in fact, the Baron's diaries will feature very, very heavily, and it's fascinating to have the German insight as the war concludes, especially with an educated man who's a very good writer in himself. Right, so what we're going to do, Nick, is we're going to progress through the month of August day by day, and I think our correspondent, so to speak, Mr. Lesota in Jersey, is going to kick us off. A night of heavy bombing.
He talks about a night of heavy bombing, likely the RAF targeting St. Malo supply lines, but it sounds like it was really heavy bombing because he talks about the explosions being so strong they shake the doors and windows, and the civilians lie awake listening for patterns in the bombing itself. And you've also got German coastal batteries are firing sporadically, and he says possibly misidentifying Allied aircraft. So I don't know what he means, whether he thinks that they're actually shooting at some German aircraft as well, because they've got form for that. We've talked about that lots of times, where they get a bit trigger happy and shoot down their own aircraft around the Channel Islands.
Well, there wouldn't have been much German air activity around the Channel Islands, particularly, would there?
From France, there would have been as well. There was sporadic activity from here, but by this point, most of the runway at the airport here was blocked for most of the time. They parked trucks on it. put wood on it occasionally and various bits and pieces. The same in Jersey.
Okay, we move to Ambrose Robin in Guernsey, the diarist. He's talking about a gentleman called Graham Buckingham who had escaped and remained at large in Guernsey. And he escaped in the Trusher area of town. And what did he do? He went on the run in Guernsey.
He went on the run. Graham Buckingham was 24 at the time. He was a well-known local footballer and athlete, so probably perfect if you're about to run away from a couple of Germans. He was sentenced at the end of July 44 to 2 years imprisonment for thefts from Germans. Many people have been done for that by that point. They tried to deport him to France on the 28th of July. So basically you go from court straight to being deported. We see that quite a bit where people, if they're deporting people to prison in mainland Europe, you're sentenced and you're gone, basically. So they were marching him down to the White Rock. He escaped in the Trusher. He bent down, pretending to tie his shoe. 2 German guards just carry on walking past. Carry on walking while he's tying his shoe. Anyway, he waits till they're far enough away from him, and then he legs it through the Canishers, a Valois-en-Rain behind Candy, into Gibaudry, the Creutes, and
towards the Martins, Saints Bay area.
The Saints Bay area makes good his escape.
But if he ran from there to there, he's doing very well.
Well, especially when you think he's going to be the same as everybody else. He's going to be suffering from malnutrition, etc. Now, his initial plan, he'd obviously thought this through. He and a friend had previously built a canoe in St. Martin, and they'd hidden it in St. Martin's for emergencies. And now they'd obviously been irritating the Germans a wee bit, so they'd planned ahead for it if they wanted to escape. He tried to reach it, but found that he couldn't get there because since they put the canoe there, the Germans were guarding the cliffs much more heavily. So he slept in an old cottage overnight. He then managed to get the canoe. He moved it to Portenfer, so he went a hell of a long way.
We'll say in island terms, this is right across the island. So this is a canoe. It's not sort of you carry on your arm, and there was very little road traffic. It was quite a feat to get the canoe from St. Martin's through to Pointerberg.
I'm not really sure quite how he managed that, but he did. I mean, this comes from an account from him post-war about exactly what happened. He got to Portenfer. He was warned by a fisherman that it was way too rough, so he knocked that on the head. Always good to take advice from a fisherman. You frequently see it in my book about escapes that if people aren't familiar with the sea, they consult fishermen. And to be fair, the escapes that go wrong in Jersey are generally where people ignore the advice of a fisherman or experienced seafarer who says, do not try this, you don't know what you're doing, it's too dangerous, etc. The ones that sadly go wrong tend to be those. He spent the night in a farm stables. In the end, he ended up spending about 2 months in hiding. He got help from people that he knew in the Portenfer area. In particular, the de Jersey family offered him refuge, and he stayed for them for 2 months, basically, only exercising in the garden after curfew, which, given that he was such an athlete and footballer, must have been quite frustrating for him, to be fair. There was an anonymous letter that claimed that there was a radio in the de Jersey's house, and the German field police searched the property, and he narrowly avoided being discovered by retreating into the loft in the kitchen. But quite often, the de Jersey family had visitors, and he had to leg it and go and hide somewhere in the house to avoid anybody else knowing that he was actually there. The Germans were absolutely furious about this. They tried all sorts of stuff to try and lure him out. There were threats made to his parents. He did actually go and visit his parents on occasion, which must have been incredibly dangerous. He went to stay with relatives, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Waugh in St. Martin's, but he did injure himself after falling on a bottle, and they had no choice but to go to hospital, and that, of course, led to his recapture. Now, there were initially stories that he'd been given away at the time during the occupation, but he cleared that up after the occupation when he said, no, what happened was injured myself with a bottle. I had no choice. I had to go to a hospital. The doctor was not responsible for my recapture. They did everything they could. But of course, once the Germans found out he was in hospital, they put a policeman on guard. He spent 4 weeks there before he was shoved back into prison, although he was allowed to visit Dr. Gibson under police escort twice a week to check he was okay. Slightly oddly, he ends up in prison until May 45 because he's been on the run for so long. It's done him a massive favour because the Germans have got no appetite for shipping him off the island because it's too flipping difficult. They've got enough trouble as it is getting stuff in and out. It's barely happening. So he's saved himself from ending up in a horrible prison somewhere in Germany, because they'd have had to get him across France, which would largely, but large chunks of it had been retaken by the time he's recaptured. But he didn't get released from prison until the 10th of May, which was one day later than most people who were locked up in the prison. The newspapers here were all over it. So by the 12th of May 45, the Star, 2 days after his release, the Star's already published his dramatic story.
Have you got a copy of that? Have you got a Star for that day?
I have got a copy of the Star for that day, actually. I didn't bring it with me. But they tried all sorts to try and get him out. The Germans were just furious about the fact this guy was on the run. It appeared in the papers numerous times. They threatened his parents with imprisonment. It was only the intervention of the bailiff and various other government officials here that prevented his family suffering reprisals. But there were constant threats about it. So it's quite an interesting story, and that he actually managed to stay on the run for such a long period of time, bearing in mind that there's about one German for every 3 people by that point.
I mean, it was quite amazing. He went to see his parents. I mean, the War family, I know where the War family lived. They lived up near the top of Mullen-Wet in St. Martin, so that's probably where he may have stashed the canoe in the first place.
Quite possibly. I forgot that's your neck of the woods, isn't it?
Yes, it is, very much so. Okay, so also we've got quite a lot of labourers here that need to be evacuated. Now, these presumably are organisation-towed workers.
Both voluntary and some forced workers.
So the Germans are getting them off the island to obviously go to mainland France, then presumably.
Well, they'd shipped quite a lot away previous to D-Day anyway, and slightly afterwards. But yeah, there were rumours going around that there were 16 ships coming to evacuate them. I'm not sure that was quite correct. There were certainly some were got away, but shipping was problematic by this point anyway. But Ord took it as just being a sign of German panic in general. That strand goes throughout the diaries throughout the month of August as to they don't really know what to do. And we talked about it in the June and July episodes. They're kind of keeping themselves busy because they don't really know what to do.
Well, I think the Germans were scared about any internal uprising, weren't they?
They were.
And also, every person shipped off the island is another mouth less to have to worry about.
We'll come to that in later episodes about there is real appetite from the German side to try and get rid of non-productive people.
Yeah.
They want the British to take them away, basically. But of course, the British are never going to agree to that. But we'll touch on that when we get to
yes, that's right.
September or October episode. I can't remember which. I think it's September that first starts to be mooted.
But Violet Carey, one of our regular diarists as well. Now, she's connected to the Carey family. Now, the Carey family, it would have been her uncle-in-law who was a bailiff.
I think so.
And so she visits members of the Carey family. So she was very much in the know to a degree of what the government were thinking. And I think it's now that we're starting to, the island, the bailiffs of here in Guernsey and Jersey, starting to reach out to try and find if they can get assistance from the Red Cross.
They're reaching out to the protecting power, which was Switzerland, and also to the Red Cross themselves as well. And those attempts were being assisted by von Schmettau, the commandant. Now, we've got to remember that Hofmeier was here already. He became the commandant later on. He basically deposed von Schmettau because he was sent here in the first place to keep an eye on von Schmettau because it was felt that he was being too lenient on the local population.
Yeah, because Hofmeier was a supporter of the regime. He was a Nazi.
He was a complete nutter, let alone that. He was a complete and utter nutcase.
And Count von Schmettau was connected, I think we said this before, through marriage to General von Rundstedt. So he was in himself quite well connected to the German staff.
From memory, he was his uncle by marriage.
Yes, he was.
And that actually proved to probably save von Schmettau from a nasty end later on when he'd been shipped off the island. Going back to, I was talking to a chap that I had on tour yesterday, and I was explaining to him about von Schmettau because he was wondering what it was. It's like the usual question that you get: did the Germans ever come back post-war? And I explained to him about von Schmettau and the fact that he'd written to the bailiff of Jersey after the war to inquire about the people of Jersey whilst he was in captivity as to how they had fared after he'd been forced to leave the islands. He was genuinely interested and asking about people by name, people that he'd encountered through having to deal with the civilian authorities. and that he came back in the 60s and was extensively interviewed on Channel TV.
He was, as Richard Hume tells it, he came incognito, and Richard found out and met him and assured him that his presence on the island was welcomed.
Because basically he either ignored, or if he couldn't ignore an order completely, he did his best to mitigate the effect of it. I mean, he was the one who ignored the order, the initial order to deport civilians for an entire year. And it was only when the Swiss made an inquiry about how the deported civilians were, the German authorities in Germany actually went, hang on a minute, they haven't been deported. What's going on here? So, it's so we talked about that, but the Count's incredibly well educated as well. He writes he's one of the few Germans that writes in English to the bailiff. Now, nearly all of the communications between the German authorities, no matter what rank the individuals are written in German, and then you get a translation. But he writes to the bailiff in English and in French.
Yeah, directly. And here he's writing to, I think, the Red Cross, or framing the letter for the
Red Cross,
bailiff Carey to send to the Red Cross. So he's writing the approach in German and in German, and bailiff Carey is framing it in English and in French.
But a very interesting character. So we'll hear more from him as we go on.
Okay, now back in Jersey on the 2nd of August, our friend Mr. Lesota, he's keeping an eye on what the BBC are saying, or keeping an ear on what the BBC are saying. Nick, did Lesota have a radio at that time? Was he just well connected?
He had a radio. Yeah. He had more than one. I think we've touched on that before. He had to get rid of some because he had one at work. He certainly had at least one, maybe two at work that he had hidden away. He also, it appears, had one at home, but he had more than one. We talked about he had a chum who was basically charged with looking after radios for the Germans in terms of fixing them when they broke and things like that. So I don't think he had any problems with getting his hands on a radio. And he records in his diary numerous times, so the number of times that he almost got caught. So,
again to Ambrose Robin, who he's commenting on the fact that we return to Mr. Buckingham's escape. His family were very nearly themselves deported then, and the bailiff intervened in that.
Yeah, and they managed to prevent it. Again, there's probably an element of it would have been too difficult to actually get them out of the island, but they could have well been locked up for the duration otherwise.
Our friend Reverend Nord is talking about yet another new order controlling firewood prices. Yeah. So this is with an eye to the winter, because this is August 44. Greenhouse timbers, the wood, it seems, was, if you manage to get hold of this ex-greenhouse timber, it sparked badly, and he makes a point about the people's carpets might suffer as this wood sparks in the grate.
I don't know if you've ever tried burning glasshouse timbers. I certainly remember from back in the early 80s when I was a kid, where my granddad had glass houses, and if you'd replaced bits of wood and you were you quite often burn some of the stuff. Guy Fawkes, we'll bung a few of the bits of old wood that we've got kicking about on the bonfire, and boy, does that stuff spark. I don't know if it was like the paint, quite possibly the lead in the paint. Or I mean, that paint probably wasn't very good for you anyway. I imagine the fumes were great for you either. There were speculators buying up glasshouse timbers at really cheap rates and charging excessive prices, which the Germans cracked down on shortly after this. But Ord's also worried because he's saying the Germans seem a bit more prepared than normal. But
we know that there was a lot of movement of munitions and things across the island to and froing. We'll get to that. But again, moving through into the third, Sota had a soul-satisfying row with a friend supplying potatoes to the Germans.
He doesn't hold back. You remember one of the earlier episodes, he shone a torch at one of his neighbours who was consorting with a German, shall we say, and shouted stuff at them out the window. And he doesn't hold back. I'm frankly amazed that Lesota never got it. He talked to him. It was about 1942. He talks about the fact that he'd broken so many of the orders that the Germans had that even if he'd been sentenced then for all of them, he wouldn't live long enough to serve out his sentence.
Now, I think when we start doing our post-occupation legacy programs next, some of our diarists, we need to sort of try and follow up what they did after after the...
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
We can follow that up. Ambrose Robin was also talking on this day about Tony de Putran being arrested for making wireless sets and reflects on the fact that the Germans are now paranoid about people getting information from the outside world. They're probably more worried actually about their own troops now.
Exactly.
To what's going on. We've got the battle for St. Malo is rumbling on at this point, and we'll get to that later. I get a little bit overexcited about that and peaks a bit too soon, if you ask me, but we'll come to that shortly. They're really paranoid about people finding out what's really going on. Worried, like you say, worried about whether there might be an uprising. To be honest, there couldn't really be an uprising without having some troops involved, and that nearly happens in Jersey. And we will come to that. It's a bit later on in the occupation. But if it was going to happen, it was more likely it would have happened in Jersey because of the way things were going down there in terms of you had the Communist Party were quite...
that's an interesting story.
There's some very conflicting and interesting stories there. It depends which ones you put any merit to as to whether they're 100% correct or what level of percentage of truth there are to them, but some of it is backed up by documentary evidence. So it's another aspect that we will look at later on. But Ord talks about on this day as well that the organisation told labourers are ordered to report for removal to the Royal Hotel on pain of death. I mean, by that point, I should imagine a lot of them were probably given up the will to live anyway.
Well, and also the fact is that they might have felt that if they could melt away into the, into hiding, they might well have been better to do that than head off. And in fact, we see later on, they didn't quite make it on that day. But here, Nick, Lesotho talks about the arrival of US paratrooper POWs, some wounded, the first American prisoners seen by civilians. There were American POWs on Jersey.
There were. So they ended up with a prisoner of war camp in Jersey. It was Snow Hill. Was it Mount Bingham? I can't remember the exact name, but it was up near the fort in St Helier. There were various POWs that end up there. There's a couple of them that feature in my book who actually escaped in January 1945 from there. But the prisoner of war camp there is quite interesting in that the Germans are quite paranoid about the civilians seeing these POWs, which is a bit odd because you kind of think they'd be like, well, look, we're still capturing people and whatever. But they had nowhere else to put them, basically. So they ended up in Jersey. But there were a right mix of various nationalities that got captured, but primarily Americans, just because of the fact that it was mostly Americans that were coming down towards Somalia, I think.
Okay, we also find that through Ambrose that the Germans are dismantling guns in the west of Guernsey. So some of the coastal batteries, what are they doing there?
Some of the guns ended up in Jersey from here. Not really quite sure where they moved them. I've never really looked into that, but they did. No. They did move some of the guns from here.
To keep people busy, I suspect. And Reverend Ord then confirms the fact that the OT workers didn't get away, and he hears them outside his house in the small hours of the morning. He says they are heard singing lustily. So they were pretty pleased not to have gone, but
I mean, Robin also talks on the same day about evacuation is now impossible, so getting actually anybody out of the place is pretty much impossible, and that the islands are basically trapped. I mean, this goes back to, we talked about this a little bit in the June episode in July, in that the people initially thought they were going to be liberated here and then realised, no, well, they're not coming for us. And basically it's because you've got a prisoner of war camp that you don't need to guard. You've got 30,000 Germans and you don't need to guard them, so why would you bother? And apart from that, there'd be massive loss of life, both military, the forces trying to retain the islands, and also the civilian population. So, all in all, it's just not worth it. And it's not a great optic if you end up killing a whole load of your own people.
No. And Ord talks about 600 civilian workers discharged, mainly to which would have a sort of mitigating effect on the bread ration insofar that people would move from being classed as a heavy worker. Is this including Guernsey people or just...
No, this would be local people. So you've got 600 civilian workers are discharged from working for the Germans, because basically the Germans got naffle for them to do.
That's 600... As many as that?
That have been made to go and drive for the Germans, driving supplies around the island, that kind of stuff, or doing other work for the Germans. There's no building of fortifications and stuff going on by this point. And so that's all done and dusted. But they would have got an extra ration for heavy workers, which meant they got more bread than other people. They of course immediately lose that ration, so that their pressure on them and their families for food is.
But presumably, where would their income have come from then? Would they have been through local firms that are working for the Germans?
Well, a bit of both, depending. But these are probably the 600 civilian workers are probably paid directly by the Germans mostly.
Okay, so these people have then become unemployed.
Effectively, they've got no job, but they end up getting redeployed into doing things like growing food and things like that. But they've lost the heavy worker ration out of doing the other work that they're doing.
Okay, and Violet is writing about rumours of matchbox-size wireless sets using cat's whiskers.
I'm surprised that she's only talking about this now, because it's been going on for a long time. It's been going on since 42, so middle of 42 at that. So that's again back to why public telephone boxes were absolutely useless by very shortly into the autumn of 42, because every time they replaced the earpieces, people nicked them to use for headphones for their crystal radio sets.
And here Ambrose Robin writes about Uncle Nick. Was there a story around that?
No, that's just one of his relatives who had been unwell for quite some time, and it just notes that he's finally died. Obviously, he's quite upset about that.
Yeah. And here we hear of an incident on the 7th of August. It's reported, I think, if it's the same incident, it must have been both in Guernsey and Jersey, that munitions are being moved around the island, and some landmines had just been moved and stacked up at the side of the road, and a German truck reverses into them, and 10 Germans are killed.
I'm guessing that they were sat in the back of the truck at the time, I would imagine, or way too close to a pile of landmines.
My information about the German war dead sort of finishes before 1944, so I've not been able to verify that figure.
I've not looked at that, to be honest, and you're never quite sure because it gets exaggerated.
And as we say, Reverend Ord in Guernsey confirms that he's heard about that. Saccharin tablets are now being issued to civilians because they'd had no sugar or sweetness for some time, and it's a cause for celebration. And just tiny little things like that we just do not think about doing.
Exactly. Sugar has just been pretty much impossible to get your hands on.
And there's a general overall feeling amongst the German troops as well, the German military, that they see themselves very much as out of the war now.
The ones here in the Channel Islands, yeah, well, that's us done. Apart from, of course, of course, there's a large contingent of German officers who don't think they're out of the war. Hofmeier being one of them.
And the other thing that comes over is the military operations, both attacking and defending St. Malo, were huge. I mean, it's quite a story in itself, isn't it? The military operations around St. Malo. But it's almost as if the Channel Islands has got a ringside seat to hear this.
Yeah,
and watch they're talking about massive, hundreds of planes passing overhead.
Yeah. And particularly in Jersey, because they're that bit closer to what's going on, they can see what's been going on the French coast. And it talks about naval actions between Jersey and St. Malo that are confirmed by the BBC. There's all sorts going on. The Battle of St. Malo is fairly vicious. I mean, for people who don't know, if you go and see the Intramuros, the walled town at St. Malo, most of that's been rebuilt. It's been rebuilt as it was, pretty much. So it looks really old, but that was pretty much flat.
It was, and I think we said last episode, I think I read it's the first place that napalm was ever deployed. And we're getting lots and lots of, hundreds of wounded Germans arriving in the islands by hospital ship, and the hospitals, German hospitals presumably, military hospitals, are overwhelmed. I never realised it was as many as that.
Yeah, of course they end up in the underground hospital here, they end up in the one in Jersey as well. They've got nowhere else to take them, to be fair. If you're fighting a battle on the French coast and the Allies are inland of you, well, what are you going to do with your wounded troops if you're trying to get them out of the place? So, yeah. And again, Sosa talks about naval action around Jersey and houses being damaged at St. Brelard.
Houses being damaged at St. Brelard's on the coast there, Nick. Is this incoming fire, or is this sort of result of German battery fire outwards?
I don't know, to be honest. It could be either or both.
So it's possible the Allies actually fired on the Channel Islands, is that right?
They did. We'll come to that a little bit later.
Okay. Sorry to preempt.
No, that's all right. We'll get to that very, very shortly.
Okay. Reverend Ord now talking about the German rations, strictly, because I think he's had a visit from his friend Reinhard. He's talking about one loaf for 5 days, sugar and butter reduced. This is military rations. And they were very much counting on a shipment of flour to arrive for the military.
Yeah.
And what turned up, Nick?
Meant. Not very. Although, to be honest, if you've heard anybody talk about the quality of the bread and the fact that it was quite grey, it might well have been made out of cement for all it was worth. So it was just logistical chaos. They didn't really know what the hell was going on. I mean, cement was completely useless for them by this point. They'd stopped building fortifications. There's absolutely no need for it.
And the Germans are seen digging trenches in areas Guernsey thought to be preparing for street fighting.
Because he's talking about Lego Down, which is on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. So they're doing all sorts of stuff. I mean, they dug up Park up by Beausejour. They dug up that. They're digging trenches all over the shop. Ord talked about a couple of months ago about digging trenches around by his house when he just really can't understand why they're doing it other than they're doing it to keep busy.
Violet Carey, a really quite interesting diary comment that she has seen some German soldiers doing a physical exercises, and she describes it as being very, very sloppy. And she contrasts that. It can only be in her mind about how British troops would perform their drill. So an odd comment to make, but she contrasts it with British discipline. But these little insights into the way that the Germans are, slowly relaxing, controlling in reality, but still issuing these sort of controlling orders.
Oh, very much so. The guys are getting sloppy, but you can imagine they're tired, they're hungry, their heart's not really in it. They're going back to the comment about they're out of the war. Realistically, your German, corporal or whatever is thinking, well, this is all over. This is all just a bit flipping pointless. Why do I have to parade? Why do I have to do this? They've got their heart's not in it.
We have some insight here as well from Baron Van Alf. He talks about St. Malo now.
Yeah.
Falling and the islands are completely cut off.
He's a bit previous. This is the 11th of August and pretty much most people will agree that St. Malo finally fell on the 16th. I think what he's really talking about is the outskirts of St. Malo because the walled town itself, Citadel, certainly carries on for quite a while. And the island that's just off of St. Malo, is it Cézombre or something like that? You pronounce it. You see it when you come in on the ferry. But out for quite some time, and they were lobbing shells at the Allies in St. Malo. So he's a bit previous maybe with the saying that the whole of St. Malo has fallen.
But he reports that as a result of fighting thus far in St. Malo, 1,400 sailors have reached Jersey. And he comments about that they are simply, additional mouths to feed. And he ventures the opinion it would have been better had they stayed in St. Malo and supported the German troops there.
Quite. But he also talks about American POWs arriving, in particular one American soldier who's very, very badly burned, but not only is he badly burned, he's been shot in both shoulders. But von Aufsess says he's expected to survive. But, well, frankly, we had very little in the way of medical stuff to be treating people anyway. I don't know if this gentleman survived or not, but it'd be amazing if he did.
And the other thing that comes out of the Baron's writings at this stage is that the ripples that came out of the July assassination attempt on Hitler really do lap up in the Channel Islands, don't they?
And he's talking about it's no longer sufficient to think like a good German. And he's reflecting on the fact that you've got 6 naval propaganda agents are sent to the islands, and when the Baron calls it absurd in this hopelessly besieged fortress. And bearing in mind, we've got we've got almost 10 months left to go before.
I mean, so these agents, that these 6 naval propaganda agents, these are sort of to stiffen resolve?
They're just to push German propaganda around the place. It's crazy. It is quite interesting that the Baron curses himself in his diary for not taking more notes so far. He expresses the opinion that these are exciting times, that old thing which is often seen as a curse. You live in exciting times.
The Chinese,
whatever it was. He talks about Malo being captured and the islands being completely cut off, whether he was slightly preempting that. I mean, the Germans had destroyed the port at Malo by this point anyway, because they didn't want the Allies to use it. They went around blowing everything up. So it was in a right old mess when the Allies finally did get their hands on it. Of course, the Allies had been bombing the living daylights out of Malo as well. He reflects on the fact that everyone in the Channel Islands is in effect, to a greater or larger extent, a prisoner, English and German alike. They can hear all the fighting on the French mainland, and it's starting to subside. So that's an indicator that the Germans are on the way out. And it's quite funny. He says, there are Germans that he knows that are joking that due to their forgetfulness, the British have abandoned us.
German humour.
I'm not sure that's that funny, but he's not happy about all these people that are turning up, the American prisoners of war, etc.
I mean, the other thing is one of the things that Orders heard on the BBC, which I know, looking into my own family research, that members of my family that managed to evacuate were contacted as early as 1943 to see if they wanted to come back to the Channel Islands. And Orders heard through the BBC that it is claimed that 30,000 evacuees are preparing to return. And this is sort of scoffed at in local circles here, because, yes, it's all very well for these people to come back, but what on earth do they think they're coming back to? Because the locals are fully aware of the vandalism to houses that have been perpetrated by the Germans, and locals wondering really what is in these people's minds that they're coming back to see.
And we should be clear that 30,000 would be across the Channel Islands.
That's right. Yeah,
wouldn't just be here, because that would have been more people than had left Guernsey. But I've seen the forms. You can look them up on National Archives at Kew.
And on Find My Past Goods.
You can find them there as well. And these did start going out. I think it was September 42, something like that. September 43, something like that. But certainly, I've seen ones that are dated October 43 from people, and it asks about where are you going to live. Now, that's a very difficult question to answer, because you've got no idea if your house is still there, or it's, if it's in a condition that you could actually live in it. Where are you going to work? What was your job before you left? That kind of thing. But it wouldn't surprise me if 30,000 was probably fairly on the nose.
Sounds about right.
Across the islands, because particularly when you look at the people wanting to come back immediately post-liberation, they have to control who can come back into the island. That's the whole reason why they're asking these questions, is they want to work out who they're going to allow to come back and when. What sort of people, what was your job? Is that question is basically framed because they want to know, are you going to be useful to contribute at a very early stage of returning after liberation? Or are you actually not really going to be that much?
They're triaging who's going to come back.
Basically, if you're a builder or something like that, they're going to want you back as soon as possible to start rebuilding the island. If you're an accountant like me, they're probably not that bothered. You're down the list somewhere. You might get back a bit later on, unless you've got some particular skill related to that. So there's also, we're talking about whether they'd have a home to come back to or not. Ord talks about demolition of a house at Albeck because it's in the line of fire for a German gun battery down there. And he says, it was a house that was renovated before the war and situated Albeck. And he says, the Germans didn't like the suggestion. They thought it was a bit silly that maybe if they'd moved the gun battery a little bit, they could have left the house where it was. I love the terminology that he uses. He says the suggestion that the gun could have been resited just a trifle to one side was not well received by the apostles of a superior culture. Yeah. I think it's brilliant. Louis Gilmer actually thinks that the demolition is an improvement. He's clearly not a fan of the house, and we still see that today, where people talk about, look at they've put a modern house up on the coast or whatever. So it does kind of ring a little bit true about people whinging about the quality of some of the, but does it look in keeping with? Yeah, so I don't know if it was some sort of modern construction or something like that.
There was also,
which you took exception to. I really don't know.
There'd also been previous demolition along the coast road at Albeck. There was a house right on the edge of the coast there.
There was,
and because of the railway, they demolished that house as well. That was earlier in.
It's a bit like Thomas Delaruy's house up by the Forest Stores there. There's a blue plaque for Thomas Delarue where his house would have been, because it's on that corner where they widened the road. They knocked his house down so they could put them a Morris battery guns through up that road because they couldn't get it through. That's where we went, and Richard nearly got run over. He was so busy regaling us with the story of it that he almost stepped backwards into the road. We had to stop it. I think Pierre stopped him from ending up in the road. We talked about houses getting demolished. Around the coast, there were about 200 in Guernsey that got demolished because the Germans were worried they were going to be used by troops attacking the islands, etc., or they were just simply in the way.
Yes, and in fact, some of the research I've been doing into one of the local artists that wrote a journal during the war, she had one of her studios out west, overlooked the coast. She had that demolished, and you can go and look in the archive and find the documents where people were able to apply for reparation for the war.
After the war, there was that. There's quite detailed documents, even down to. I've looked at a couple of properties that were of interest to me, and you even get things like there's letters about people saying, "Oh, this house is empty at the moment, but I've noticed through the window it's got a particularly nice bird cage and I could do with a new one. Is it possible for me to borrow it?" It's completely bizarre, some of the comments. But there were meticulous documents kept of what was in the houses of people that were evacuated. Lovell's actually did quite a lot of those. If you go and look at the reports, there's the Lovell's auctioneers and estate agents, I think they were at the time, they're estate agents now, doing these very detailed reports of what things were in the property and even down to putting a note that, I removed these and put them into a locked cupboard in this room here for their own protection so that people didn't take them.
Indeed, and in fact, the very room we're sitting in now was a tomato packing building during the war, and the lady that survived her husband at the end of the war, I've seen the documents she put in for reparation, right, and for the loss of the first tomato crop of the year, 1940, and she was even issuing all receipts for the bales of twine and all right down. She got over £500, which in 1945, 46 was an enormous amount of money.
I did see one, I can't remember who it was now, that I looked at. And I was looking for something completely different. I wasn't actually looking for this. I was looking for something else in their records. And there was protracted correspondence because he got very angry because he had a pistol that he'd kept from his service in the First World War. And the Germans he'd had to hand it in. And he was trying to get reparations for his pistol. And there was backwards and forwards about it. And basically they went, no, get stuffed. It was probably British government property in the first place because you had it from the army. In the First World War, you probably should have given it back so you can get lost, mate. You're not having any money for that. And then he got a receipt. Then there's a receipt in the file for the money that he did receive back for items that had been lost from his house, minus the pistol.
Right. So here I'm just looking at, there was some quite big naval battles off the coast. I think one convoy got into a big trouble.
We talked about shipping being harassed around here quite a lot, but it seems that as they've got control of the French coast, down from Cherbourg all the way down to St. Malo, that there's a lot more going on in terms of naval battles to stop things like the Germans shipping people out of here or into here as well. And quite a bit going on in that respect, and people can see what's going on.
The other thing that Lesotho talks about is sniper pits being dug in gardens and street corners. And I wonder, Nick, in Queen's Road where the governor's residence is, at the top of where the road comes up from Prince Albert, there's an aperture in the wall there.
Yeah, that's a machine gun position.
Yes, that's right. Do you think that would have been, and there's one in a wall of a house not far from here, up from Ladies' Bay, would these have been something that would have formed a part of defences in the latter part of the war when...
Yeah, quite probably. I don't know when the one at Government House was put in. You probably could find that out. I'm sure if we asked some people that we knew, but I've never really thought about it more than that. Other than that, you do see these, quite a lot of them have been filled in, but you can actually see because of the different colour of stone or different stone that's been used. But the one at Government House is still open. You can still see see that would have been in a position to cover you've got the junction there, so you'd have had a field of fire to prevent anybody from coming up that road.
Now, the other thing that occurs, a big thing occurs in August, is an attack on Alderney from HMS Rodney. Now, this was quite significant, wasn't it?
Yeah, you're not messing about with HMS Rodney. She's got 16-inch guns, 3 triple turrets, and is capable of hurling a 2,000-pound shell, which is 929 kilos. If you're talking modern weights, and they could lob that 38 kilometres to 1,000 yards. Quite a formidable ship that was there. Now, HMS Rodney opened fire on Battery Blucher at just after 2:00 at extreme range. They were lying close to Cherbourg. They're firing over the coast effectively. And they're using a Spitfire aircraft from number 26 Squadron RAF. Basically, they're acting as spotter for them, reporting the fall of the shot. And they fired mostly single rounds, so it wasn't a sustained barrel as such. They're trying for precision here. They're trying to actually take out these things. They're not going to waste loads of ammunition lobbing them. But they fired 75 high explosive shells over a period of 2.5 hours. 3 of the 4 German guns were put out of action, although albeit only temporarily out of action in some of the cases. A couple of German soldiers were killed. All the Spitfires returned safely, as did HMS Rodney, and left the German occupiers in the Channel Islands in no doubt that they would actually attack the Channel Islands if they had to. I mean, Alderney, they were less bothered about the fact that they were shelling British soil because they knew that there was hardly anybody there from in the way of islanders, whether they considered anything about anybody else that might have been there, certainly the political prisoners, etc. A lot of them had been taken away by that point, but there were still quite a few there. They obviously decided that they weren't that fussed about them, although, to be fair, lots of French people were killed during bombardments of the French coast, etc., because it was just the thing that they had to do because they couldn't retake Europe without doing that. And sadly, that was just one of the things that happened. Now, I've got a funny little story about this. I looked into a gentleman who was a German who was based in Guernsey, and he went to the UK as prisoner of war after the occupation, after liberation, and he'd been based in Alderney for a while, and he was up there when this happened. And he stayed in Yorkshire. He didn't go back to Germany because he was going to end up in what became East Germany. He married a Yorkshire lady, and that's how he got to stay in the UK. And you can listen to his interview. I'll put a link. You can listen to his interview. It's on the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive. And he's got a really weird accent, and the way he talks is really weird because by the time they interview him, he's spent the best part of 50 years in Yorkshire. So he's using Yorkshire, terminology. He's got a slightly strange Yorkshire/German accent, which is a bit odd. But he talks about the fact that by the late 60s, early 1970s, he'd made friends with quite a few old soldiers and sailors that were British. And he talks about that he went down the pub one day. He used to go and meet these guys down the pub and have a few beers and talk about the war. And he talks about, he mentioned that he was on Alderney when HMS Rodney attacked Alderney. And one of his mates that he's made, who was former Royal Navy, says, "Oh, sorry about that, lad. That was me." Turned out he was, I think he was a gunner on HMS Rodney, and he's like, "Oh yeah, sorry about that, mate. It was me that was doing that." It's just one of those weird coincidences.
Well, I'm in the process of trying to buy an old house in St Anne's in Alderney, and I'm looking forward to, if we do secure the property, to researching it, because it certainly existed in the Second World War.
Yeah,
so it'd be
to find out exactly what
happened in and around it.
And if you want to see HMS Rodney bombarding Alderney, there is actually video of it it's on YouTube, but it's also on the Imperial War Museum website. Again, I'll shove a link in for that. It's only a few minutes long. There's one that's about 2 minutes long, and it was done. I think it was Pathé. It was done clearly for British propaganda, etc. And there's another version that's about 6 minutes long. I'll hook that out and stick that on the socials and in the show notes as well.
Now, as a result of this attack on Alderney from H.S. Rodney, that Ord is saying that he is aware of 15 corpses coming over to be buried in Guernsey, and he's connected to Lovells, who make or store the military coffins, and he says that their stock of coffins have been severely depleted recently. So are we aware that of any sort of people that were injured in Alderney were shipped to Guernsey for burial?
Quite possibly there would have been. I've not something I've actually looked at, but this has just made me think of something from earlier this week. I don't know if you know Mike Brown. He's chairman or president of the National Trust here in Guernsey. And as it happens, Mike, I've known Mike for quite a few years. Mike had a friend who was here, I think. In fact, Dave's still here. He's going back to the UK tomorrow, I think. So he had a friend who was here, and Mike got in touch with me and said, Dave's got a copy of your book. I don't suppose there's some way we could actually, get you to sign it for him. He'd really like that. So I popped around I said, no problem. So I popped round to go and sign it. They tempted me by the offer of a beer and a chat while I was there. And Mike showed me around his house because it's got some interesting occupation-related stuff. The guy that lived in the house during the occupation was some sort of funeral director. So Mike's got an outbuilding which has still got the flooring from where they kept the horse in there. It's really quite interesting to see it. I've not seen anything quite like that in the way. It's really, really quite nice, small cobbles with a drain and things. And next door to that, the guy used to keep his hearse that he pulled with the thing. But then Mike took me into a barn to show me the bloke who was the funeral director who lived there painted on the beams in this other building significant events that obviously took his interest. Mike said, these must just have been things that took his interest, but this is a bit of Guernsey history. And I'm sure Mike won't mind me saying this. I'm not going to tell you where the house is or anything. But it's got things like he's written on the beams in quite large letters, D-Day and how many ships and men were involved and the date. He's written other significant events from during the occupation, from pre-war as well, the Ionian being lost and things like that. The Queen talks about the Queen's visit and all sorts of just really random stuff just painted on the beams. Some of which must have been quite dodgy to have put that on the beams at the time because he could have been caught. He must have been listening to the Beeb, I would imagine, or been told by somebody.
Well, Nick, look, we've got an immense amount for August 44 that we haven't covered off yet. I think we could do a second episode.
We've only got as far as the 17th, haven't we? So I suppose we probably should, because otherwise we're going to be here for about another hour, I suspect. And there's quite a bit more to talk about. So.
Okay, so thank you very much for listening for what turns out to be episode 1 of Islands at War, August 1944. And quickly, Nick, a plug for the book, which I understand is going really...
It's going really well. Tides of Defiance, about escapes. You can get it off of Amazon, or if you're in Guernsey, go to Writer's Block and go and see Kelvin and buy a copy from there. He's been doing a sterling job of shifting copies of my book. Last time I spoke to him at the weekend, I messaged him and he was down to about 6 copies. So getting quick. So I've got some more coming in, but they won't be here for a couple of weeks.
Okay, so join us again soon, very soon, for episode 2 of August 1944. And remember, if you wish to get hold of Nick or myself, occupied@gnetradio.com is the email address. Thank you very much for listening. And for the moment, it's goodbye from Keith and also...
Bye from Nick.
Thank you very much.
Cheery.
Bye-bye. Alla Pashoin.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew